Welcome. If you were looking for the body cam FPS thing that's in the other room, you're stuck here with me now. We're in Plugin-afying Lyra, shipping a game on the UE5 Lyra framework. My name is Derek Reese. I've been doing this for about a little over 20 years. I started out in tech art and art, moved on to animation, and then finally programming and design. And now I work on all sorts of titles. Previously, I was at Xbox, where we shipped Minecraft Realms, Microsoft Flight Simulator, Master Chief Collection, working on game economies, releases, coordination, management. And now today I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm the founder of a company called Chronicler, and yes, we will be hiring soon. What we're doing at Chronicler is something a little bit different, or at least so we thought, until we talked to a bunch of other people in the field. And we realized there's a lot of frameworks out there for Unreal. And yet all of them purport to solve the same problems. And so we thought there could be a canonical way to break these issues down. And we found that, we think, with Lyra, as have many other studios. And we're going to walk you through what that modular approach looks like, what we've built internally at Chronicler, a demo of that, and then we're going to share all of that code with you on GitHub and talk about shipping on it. We'll have a little bit of a Q&A at the end. Frameworks for Unreal is something that I don't think has a really clear definition. There's a lot of items on the marketplace. There's the starter projects, but what do we really mean by that? So I asked a bunch of people, and now I want to take this opportunity to ask you in the room. So yes, this will be the interactive portion. If I could get a show of hands, how many people here today are working on a game, either hobby or for your day job, that is built directly on the Lyra sample? Okay, thank you. How many people are building on an Unreal Starter kit like shooter game? Just a few hands, okay. How many people are using a marketplace tool like Ascent Combat Framework or DCS or Art of Combat? Hey, we got a guy, awesome. Okay, how many are building their own thing referencing Lyra? Got a couple more hands here. And who's a straight up OG programmer who's just going nuts on the core engine? Yeah, those are my people. I surveyed a bunch of startups, including ours, somewhere around 40 or so, that are building new games on Unreal Engine 5. This is what we found. They're building mostly using that OG programmer methodology. And yet, like I mentioned earlier, all of the problems they were looking at solving had already been solved in Lyra, or had at least a great framework that you could start from. And some of them referenced it, but some of them just had an idea in their head when they were starting their company, and they needed to make those early decisions and just went with it. And for us at Chronicler, we have a decision point to make, the same decision when you start a new project. Do you ship with one big project from prototype to horizontal slice to vertical slice to out the door? Or do you use lots of little ones? We use lots of little ones at Chronicler for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. But before I do, let's stop for a second and talk about the prereqs here. What are the key design decisions behind Lyra? And I don't want to get too much into talking about what Lyra itself does, because there's amazing tutorials out there, amazing presentations out on YouTube. But Lyra kind of looks like this. Sorry for the jump scare, but it's almost Halloween. Hopefully you'll forgive me. Lyra itself is a gameplay framework as well as a game. And those two are very tightly coupled, which makes some really interesting points for us that I'll talk about in a second. But Lyra exists in many ways to answer the question of how do you manage loading and attaching components and systems at runtime. It is in a way an evolution of the way that game modes are presented in Unreal Engine. Lyra ships experiences and definitions of those experiences, along with their dependencies, to allow your designers to craft at runtime all of the different components that make your game serviceable, especially oriented towards a live service game. But this works really well even for a single player experience. You just don't need all of the code. And in order to enable this functionality, it ships a series of actor and system components that allow the game framework system to run during the game. Most of this information is not something I can take credit for. There's an amazing guy out on GitHub called X157. You can Google him. Absolutely incredible write-up of what Lyra actually means at an abstract level, not just what actually ships in the box. So let me break that down for you. This is a player-centric view of what Lyra does. On the left-hand side, we have all of the traditional systems that ship with Unreal Engine. And in the middle, we have the game framework system, a system that allows dynamic loading and unloading of these components at runtime. And a set of plugins that are built on top of that, the modular plugins and common plugins. Typically, most of the modular plugins provide a base level of functionality, and then the common plugins are built on top of those. And some of these systems are shown here to the right. So first we have the Experience Manager. The Experience Manager takes assets and allows them to define essentially what are becoming game modes, the experiences that ship in Lyra. It manages these experiences, allows them to load and unload at runtime, be pulled from data assets, and be something that is ultimately in the hands of designers, not just people who are programming in C++, engineers like me. There's also the pawn extension component. That also takes that same sort of thought process. You'll see there's a pattern here to it, where assets are allowed to define gameplay abilities that run on the pawn. I am simplifying here for sake of understanding the ecosystem, but it's important to have this high-level abstraction so you can understand what we decided to do with it at Chronicler. We also have the input component. The input component takes that same idea that you can use data assets and blueprints to define all of the input through the enhanced input system. And that's interesting because the enhanced input system uses tags, much like the gameplay ability system, much like many of the other systems that exist in the Lyra framework. The hero component wraps the gameplay ability system, interfaces with the ability system component, and also connects that over to enhanced input, again, using a tagging-based system. The ability system component, which ships with the ability system itself, something you might already be familiar with, but it wraps all of those systems together as well. So now we start to get a little bit of a tangle. Which does what? Who's responsible for which thing in Lyra? And then you have the UI system. That's something that we'll kind of skip over during this presentation. I don't think we have a lot of time to cover that. But it does some really incredible things. But if you start to notice, there's a line of tangling here. It almost looks a little bit like spaghetti. Every game you ship has a little bit of spaghetti to it. And you know what? One of my favorites. So here are the plugins that Lyra ships with today. If you were to go into the repo on GitHub and take a look at the Lyra sample, this is what you could pull straight from the code base. The first one is Common Game. It's incredibly useful. It's an assortment of UI and input systems, actors, and widgets that abstract the way that you handle user interfaces in your game. It doesn't provide a whole lot of the implementation details, but it provides those key building components that make it so much easier to do cross-platform UI and UX. There's also a loading screen. You have to build one for every game that you ship. Might as well take Epics. It's fantastic. It's a great baseline. You can build on top of it. Common User is a baseline for your identity and your auth systems. That one's a little bit interesting because it's mostly specialized towards eventual use with Epic Online subsystem. But for us, we found that it works really well with our in-house stuff. We just built everything on top of that. We also have the gameplay message router. So if you're used to building delegates and event systems for your games, this is a little bit of a different pattern. It's a pub sub pattern where you do not need each component that's part of your event notification system to have any awareness whatsoever of the caching mechanism of the notification system that's running that pub sub communication. This allows some really clever and useful messaging, especially in places where you have one system generating tons of events that need to be cached somewhere in a middle layer and then read arbitrarily based on arbitrary execution and arbitrary rules, like, for example, your different gameplay framework experiences at runtime. And finally, there's the UI extension plugin. And that delegates to systems. It looks like a little bit of text got cut off here. But it basically delegates to the widget systems enhanced input. And so it makes it a lot easier to create modular buttons, modular HUD, events and interfaces, and track UI state, which is something it ships with out of the box. This is what we're shipping. And all of it is based around the modular gameplay actors, which comes with Lyra, but then leaves the rest of the ecosystem open. And that's because that code is present inside the Lyra game code itself. So this is the meat of what we've done. We've taken this functionality, made some key, highly opinionated decisions around where that functionality should reside, and then put it into plugins. The first one is the Modular Gameplay Abilities plugin. This enables assigning gameplay abilities from your data assets. Like I said, there's that pattern. You're taking data, things that are in control of your designers, that they don't need to go into C++ code to work with, and then loading that at runtime based on your experience rules. It handles things like the player state, and it also manages all of the tag mappings between abilities, ability sets, as well as the ecosystem of attributes and gameplay abilities that run through the ability system itself. Modular gameplay actors, like I said, comes with Lyra, but we consider this in the modular gameplay ecosystem that we're extending. It's mostly decorator-based classes. There's not actually a ton of code in there, but they make some really key decisions around the game framework that handles that runtime dynamic loading and unloading of components that inform all of your extension decisions, all of your subclasses. It includes a player controller and a player state, as well as a character and a pawn. And that's what we base all of our characters and all of our pawns on top of. Then there's modular gameplay data. That is the lowest level part of the plugin ecosystem. That includes everything that needs to work through the asset manager. It depends on your project settings, basically configuring the asset manager, what to look for and load and unload at runtime. Everything from your input configurations with enhanced input to pawn data. On top of that, and this is sort of our wrapper plugin, is modular gameplay experiences. And this takes the heart of what Lyra is and replaces, or rather builds on top of game modes with these experiences and these user-facing experiences, which use that game framework to load configuration, assets, even models, and components at runtime. The heart of it is the game mode class, but it also comes with game state and runs all of this through an experience manager that helps the game framework understand each of those components and each of those components to work together. It brings a whole plethora of action sets that are essentially that runtime loading and unloading and configuration setting. Part of the components that ship with it are game state, modular input, modular pawn, and player spawn. All of them pretty much do what they say. They add modular input support, dynamic loading and unloading of enhanced input to the actors, and you can pretty much assume what the rest do. We'll get into that in a little bit when I do a demo. We also have modular gameplay UI that encapsulates a lot of the amazing UI work that Lyra has done. Just earlier today, I had someone mention that they had 2 Lyra projects, and one of them was able to handle loading and unloading effectively, and the other one, they had to manually reset it. And that's because a lot of that code sort of ended up in different places inside Lyra. And so what we've done is sort of collected it all, gathered it together into one plugin, and made that work for you out of the box. It includes enhanced input widgets, modular buttons and modular HUD, and UI state component that handles being able to dynamically add and remove those UI components in a designer-controlled way. Last but not least, the modal camera plugin. This is vital for the ability system, but for abilities to have that camera support, we made it an important distinction to separate that out. Because for us at Chronicler, the camera is something that we spent a lot of time, a lot of effort and R&D on, and we didn't want that tied into the ability system, but we wanted them to be able to interface and use each other. So we had to separate out that awareness, that connection point into a plugin that gave us a lot more dynamic ability to code and move kind of in a faster way with more velocity with our different engineering teams. Let's get a little bit into what you need to do in order to enable and work with these plugins. Most of our project settings, most of the way that we build our games is a blueprint class that extends from one of these core plugins. In our case, we're going to start with the Modular Experience Game Mode. That is that game mode that brings all of the Lyra native experiences and user-facing experiences to the forefront so your designers can build them with blueprint classes and data assets and load and unload them at runtime. Next is the default pawn. For us, that's a blueprint that's parented to modular experience character, and we have multi-layer steps to this. So we have a core pawn that no one but the engineers is allowed to touch, and that's a blueprint that sits on top of that class. Then we have our gameplay pawns that extend from that. So everything that's functional and vital to the base level code that the game runs on sits in that core folder in its own core blueprint. Everything that the designers play with, all of the tweaking, all of the balancing, happens in that sub blueprint. Then we have our player controller. And the common player controller is pretty much what ships out of the box. So we didn't need to make a ton of changes to it. Most of the Lyra code, I always get those two mixed up, is something that does most of this really well. And that's not something we had to spend a ton of time on. Essentially just lift and shift. Finally, the player state. Modular ability player state, there's two of them that's available, one that's experience and one that's ability. Ability is the one that uses the gameplay ability system. And that's important for us to separate that out because we know there are plenty of people out there who are building things that are not on top of the gameplay ability system. We want to be able to support that, have you use and contribute to that same ecosystem without needing to be an adopter of gameplay ability system because it may not work for your particular game. Maybe you're shipping a game with 200 plus enemies on screen, millions of projectiles, tens or even hundreds of players. That's going to be a different ecosystem you're going to need to be able to work in, but we want you to still use the Lyra experience ecosystem in your game. Next is our game mode settings. This is something that we think we got most of the crashes out of, but we're definitely looking forward for the bug reports from you. By default, we want the experience to sort of work out of the box, but there are a couple of things you need to configure. The first one is that game mode, which means you need to have a game state that's supported with modular experiences. Player controller and player state, not so much. They're mostly centered around the input system you're using. We're assuming most people are using enhanced input, but we want that option there if you've built your own. And same thing with the player state. If you're using gameplay ability system, then you'll want to use the modular ability player state as your base class. But if you're not using GAS, then we want you to have your own options for that. The HUD is pretty much lift and shift from Lyra, so you get all of your familiar debug tools and decorators in there. And of course, easy enough to build on top of. And then, like I mentioned, our default pawn is that blueprint parented to the modular experience character. So finally, that pawn blueprint. Our modular experience character has these following components, and this ecosystem does not work without them. We haven't scripted this yet, but we do want it to be one of those automatic out-of-the-box setup steps that says, hey, if you want to use this ecosystem, you're going to need all of these components on your character as a baseline. But we don't want to force you to do that in C++ in case you make differing decisions about what components you want to use, like GAS or a different HUD system or enhanced input. The first is that modal camera, of course, which if you need the character's camera to react to abilities or scripts, then you'll want to start building there. Next is that pawn extension. And so this is where we started to differ a little bit. We split out the Lyra hero component into multiple different pieces in order to separate out that gameplay ability system. So if you're using a different system, it'll still work with the ecosystem. That's a lot of systems. Provided by default, the pawn extension loads all of the pawn data from assets and orchestrates loading and unloading at runtime. The modular input component also connects that enhanced input system that we talked about. And that's that split out that I was mentioning, splitting out gameplay ability system from the input. So you can still use a tag-based system to connect these things if you want to. You can still use a tag-based system to connect a different ecosystem. Give you a second to take a look at that blueprint. And then the project content, that's the good stuff. That's the designer goodies. So these assets are prefixed by abbreviation. So we have ED for experience definition, blueprint classes or BP. What these do is essentially what you see in Lyra. It sets the default pawn data, processes actions and action sets, and enables your game features at runtime. The content is mostly split between data assets and blueprints and blueprint classes, making it sort of an easy searchable right-click, what do I want to build today for designers that are building new experiences in your game. Some of the action sets that we ship out of the box come straight from Lyra. We've also added a couple of our own, and they include everything from input mappings to adding components to actors to setting attributes by default, as well as data registries, world content, and plenty more. Who's ready for a demo? All right. I was a little sleepy, but I'll give it to you. We're only what, 2 hours from cocktail hour? We do have a live version of this installed on the machine, but we were running into issues cloning the repo, so I have a video alternative, so we don't have to rely on the internet here. So I'm going to put up a QR code in a minute, but we start at the Chronicler software GitHub, and each one of the plugins is available as its own repo, so you can choose which items to opt in and opt out of. Of course, we feel they work best as an ecosystem, and so we want you to grab them all together. But you can just grab those zip files right off of GitHub. Each one of these is a fully operating GitHub repo. There are multiple contributors. We do plan to support issue requests, but please keep in mind we're a very small indie studio. We don't have the resources of larger organizations. The next step is to grab the plugins outside of Lyra. If you don't have that sample already installed on your system, another easy way to get it is I like to use this download GitHub directory website. And you basically feed it each one of these plugin directories straight up off of GitHub. And that's download-directory.github.io. Throw that in there, and that'll grab you zip files of the repo. So if you don't want to check out the entire Lyra sample onto your local machine, quick and easy way to get started. Each one of these plugins is one that is part of that ecosystem, and we feel like is a complete part of shipping a game with this sort of Lyra build. But of course, you can always choose to bring your own. And so here's each of those plugins set up in a very base project. This is a split off of our game, so yes, those are code words, not real shipping titles. One thing I want to note is just like Lyra, when you are using the editor, you do want to take advantage of that experience manager and make sure to just grab some of this code here. This is straight up copied from Lyra, so you can grab it from there, or you can take a look at this presentation's live stream recording. Also, do not forget to add your dependencies to the build file like I do every single time I add a new plugin. Let's get that built into the game. So here's a sample. And like I said, we think we got most of the bugs and crashes out of this, but you do want to make sure you have your default game modes and classes set properly in your project settings. We have a blueprint that's built on top of most of this. There's really not an issue with encapsulating these classes, and in fact, I recommend you do so for most of these. So our game mode includes all of the same overrides from controller to HUD classes that we see in our project settings. So you want to set your pawn class, your HUD class, your player controller class, your game state class, your player state class, and spectator class is not something we really worry about shipping. Not yet anyway, but you could contribute that code. Once you have all of your project settings lined up, your next step is to go ahead and create the data assets and blueprint classes inside of your game project. There are some placeholders here, just to point that out. The first thing you want to do is make sure that your asset manager is loading those files. So that's going into under your game settings, your asset manager, and ensuring that you have defaults properly set. This is one of those things that can cause crashes if you don't have this set properly. If you're overriding any of these with classes that are not provided by the plugins, make sure they're correctly parented to those classes. We do ship a default experience, and we're also going to be shipping a number of default like weapons and content in some of these plugins, just to give you that starting experience where, if you hit play, it doesn't crash. You don't need to do extra configuration. Everything just runs out of the box. So you can get started, get rolling, and make your decisions on what to either include or exclude in your Lyra-inspired build. Most important thing is just to make sure that you're loading from the proper asset directories. And that's loading your experience definitions, your data assets for your pawns, and your user-facing experience definitions, just like you would if you were building directly off of Lyra. So in here, in our properly code-named, so nothing leaks project, we have our example data. And we're going to go ahead and build an experience definition for just Unreal Fest 2024. Let's go ahead and save that and load it up. Compiles, saves, looks pretty good. No crashes. Love it. The base things that you'll want to configure are your pawn data. Just like Lyra, that sets all of the defaults from attributes to abilities that load when your pawn's brought into and spawned in the experience. In our case, we're shipping with a couple of the default items here, so I don't think we really have time to build something completely new. Let's just go with the third-person blueprint. And we're going to use existing ability sets and tag relationship mappings. And I'll show you a little bit what those look like, though. You want to make sure that each one, of course, is parented to the correct class. So if you're extending the modular experience character, make sure that's set properly. And then here we have the gameplay abilities that are being granted when we activate this experience. Again, if you're used to Lyra, this should all be pretty familiar to you. If you're new to Lyra, these are some fantastic features that allow you to configure all of your inputs, all of your abilities, all of your characters at runtime. You get out of the box all of your enhanced input configuration and assets that you're used to, all of the gameplay tags that you need to set up your weapons, your movement systems, reloading, shooting, etc. And this is pretty one-to-one map to Lyra. So while we've changed what plugins are available and what they're responsible for to make it easier to turn them on or off, you're going to still set up most of your experiences in the exact same way. So if you've already started building directly on top of Lyra, but you found that it's a little too much, you want to take some of that away and just kind of build something new, or you want to do lots of small projects, this is a great way to say, hey, we know how to build this stuff. We're going to use these same assets. We're just going to reparent those classes and use these plugins that allow us to pick and choose which portions of Lyra we want to ship with. You can see each of the actions and action sets that we ship with the plugins. And of course, it's very easy to add your own. A lot of copy, paste, modify. All of the usual enhanced input settings are there. And load reliably at runtime. All right, let's see what that looks like in game. Make sure to set your default gameplay experience per map. So we're going to use that Unreal Fest 24 that we just configured using the defaults from the plugins. So sorry, no special gameplay leaks today. In this case, we're just using the animation set from the recently released motion matching, along with your default favorite mannequins. And a marketplace weapon, just as a placeholder. And that's all just done in that player blueprint. We were able to easily reparent that over to our modular experience character. That's the demo. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Like I said, that code is available now. We actually just got some new commits in, I think, this morning. If you are in the back, there are televisions to either side where you can scan that QR code. Check it out. Bookmark that GitHub repo. Like I said, this is all open source. It is all copyright Epic Games, so keep that in mind, of course. Fully built off of that Lyra ecosystem and then some of our special sauce and extra code that we've added in. We will continue to maintain those issue queues. This is something we plan on building on for the foreseeable future. We also have a number of other startups that are building on this ecosystem, so it's not just us. So if this is something you want to adopt, more than welcome to. Things to think about when shipping. First one is we have not shipped this code yet, but we've shipped similar code at other game studios. Good chunk of this code is also shipped with Lyra, so you kind of see how that works in the real world. Some things to think about. It really does improve designer nimbleness when they can just create a new game mode completely out of scratch without needing to add any C++. Our designers have been able to play around with this, and it's nice to be able to take things directly from Lyra where we need it, and then make decisions to discard things where we decide that it's not really a fit for what we're currently building. This code that's available on GitHub is super, super duper early. Like I said, we've shipped similar things, but this one has not shipped and is not available yet. So if you're shipping any sooner than, at least 12 months from now, please be very careful. Things are changing fast. Like I said, we got new updates this morning. We're, like I mentioned earlier, also a very tiny startup. We do not have the resources larger studios do. We're giving this code away completely for free. So your mileage may vary. Please do not sue us. Finally, something I really want to emphasize is I truly believe a rising tide lifts all boats. This is something I've seen time and time again being part of the startup ecosystem and game studio ecosystem in Seattle. This is something I've seen just watching amazing engineers work together from completely different studios to solve problems. I understand there's sometimes difficulties in making that happen, but for us, this was a core part of our founding mission, is to make sure that we contribute back to the ecosystem as much as we get from it. And this is just part of it. Our long-term roadmap is right now, where we're at today, is open sourcing the project, but it's focused on being compatible with other systems and game playability system. And what I have screenshotted here is something that my friend Jake is working on. It's also available, also open source. I don't think it's quite ready, but this is an ecosystem that is a replacement for JS that is able to work with hundreds and hundreds of thousands of replicated enemies, projectiles, abilities, and all of the interactions between them. It does something really neat in that it reassembles all of the gameplay at runtime on each system and syncs it back up. And so when you have those hundreds of thousands of entities that the game is tracking, it's still able to readjust it. It's his thing. I don't want to get too much into it, but it's really cool. And it's something that we want to support out of the box, is these efforts from other startups and other groups in the community to expand and release features that build on top of Unreal Engine. So that compatibility is 100% in our roadmap and something we're thinking about very seriously long term. Don't check my watch. Okay, got just a couple minutes here for Q&A. I think this timer is off, but I want to make sure that we finish up on time.